All right, welcome back, everyone, to another enlightening episode of the All Me podcast. And today we have a very special guest with us who is going to share his personal experience and expertise as we dive into the world of bodybuilding. So, joining us today is Ron Harris, who has immense experience in the bodybuilding industry and is also an accomplished author who is open and willing to share all of his experience with us. So, Ron, thank you so much for joining us today on the All Me podcast.
Thank you for having me, Don. Appreciate it very much.
You bet. Yeah, we had a chance to meet on Dr. O'Connor's The Anabolic Docs podcast where we did Teens on Trend, which was a really interesting episode that's out now that people can find on YouTube. But, I enjoyed talking with you there and had reached out to Dr. O'Connor and said, hey, do you think Ron would be willing to come on our podcast as well? So I'm really glad you're taking time out of your day to do this.
Yeah, God, it's an important subject, man. I really want to do what I can to get some awareness out there.
Well, we really appreciate it. So you've got a very extensive background in bodybuilding and the fitness industry. So I really want to dive into that with you here while I have you today. And, I'd like to really start from the beginning, though. So what got you into the fitness industry, that took you into the bodybuilding industry, that brought you to where you are today?
Okay. Yeah, so I was a smaller kid. I was always the shortest or almost the shortest kid. Never any good at sports. I discovered wrestling later in high school, but it was kind of too late at that point. So I got into weight training basically as that kid who wanted to get the bullies to leave him alone and the girls to start noticing him. I started off high school at 4'10" and 90 pounds. By the time I graduated, I was 5'8" and 130 pounds. So not a huge guy still, but I got into the industry side of it. My final year in college, I did an internship out in Los Angeles for a company called American Sports Network, and they were producers of content for ESPN and ESPN2 later. They did a show called American Muscle Magazine that was monthly. We produced event specials for the Mr. Olympia, Ms. Olympia, Nationals, USA Championships, things like that, Arnold Classic. I started off as an intern writing scripts and being like a production assistant, and very quickly I got hired full-time to become an associate producer. So for 8 years, I worked in TV production for bodybuilding, and a couple of years into that, on the side, I started submitting freelance articles to the bodybuilding magazines, and I was getting published. And I was, so I've been published author in the magazine since like early 1992, over 5,000 articles published. But yeah, so I was with Muscular Development from, it's funny, from almost, we're recording this on 9/11. And it was 9/11/2001 that I was writing my first article for them.
Wow.
You'll remember. So that was 2001. And I was with them all the way up until the magazine and the company went out of business in November of 2023. But it was a great ride. I got to meet, I know everybody. It's a small industry. Everybody knows everybody. So, I was at all the pro shows, a lot of the national shows. I've known most of these pros since the 90s and watched them come up. So yeah, it's been you'll get into it more, but I've been a bodybuilder myself for obviously many, many years too.
Yeah, and I'd love to just kind of talk as we go through sort of this discussion, how the bodybuilding industry has changed over the years, obviously with technology and weights and science and all that sort of stuff. But when you were first, getting into weightlifting and the fitness and that sort of thing, were you self-taught? Did you have somebody there to guide you along the way? But, and I know you were writing for this industry, but what really captured you as far as, hey, this is something I'm interested in. I love working out. I love lifting weights. I love bodybuilding. What took you down that path?
Yeah. I mean, there was no internet when I started. My first weight set was Christmas of 82. So I was just turned 13 a couple months before, and I was doing it all the way through high school, graduated in 87. I remember distinctly the turning point for me was I got a free magazine in the mail from buying a big jug of Weider weight gainer or something, and I had sent away for it, and it was a Flex magazine. I got that I had just arrived at my first semester of college, and I opened up the pages, and I was just hooked on it. I got it. I have to look like this no matter what it takes. Yeah. I really had no awareness that these were drug enhanced physiques or anything, but I was just immediately obsessed with it. I went out and bought books, magazines. I was already training, but I doubled down. I got so obsessed, so hooked on it. It was just the look. I really wanted to look like that.
It's so funny, Ron, because it brings back memories when you're like you sent away for whatever it was, right? I remember it being baseball cards, gum, like you had those ads within the magazines, and when we do our programs today, we show kids pictures of magazines, and it's kind of funny. You use the joke like, "Hey, I just want to first explain to you what these are. These are magazines." Essentially, it was paper social media at the time.
Yeah.
Where today the media is consumed on our phone, iPads, or whatever device that we have. And, but the messaging has sort of always been the same. But today, obviously, the access to information is so much different, where you have young people tuned into whatever fitness influencer is super popular right now, and they're consuming that information that way. But when it comes to the bodybuilding industry, and as you're talking with young people, and I know you have kids as well, but and somebody wants to get into this industry, do you have how do you get into starting to compete? Number one, do you need a coach? And then kind of take us through what that will look like going all the way up to some of the bigger shows. And I know people know the Arnold Classic and the Mr. Olympia and Ms. Olympia, but talk about what that path looks like.
Yeah. So, I think the vast majority of people out there who weight train and all that, and I consider everyone that wants to change their body with weights and nutrition supplements, that's a bodybuilder.
Okay.
Competitive bodybuilders are a much smaller group of
Okay.
that portion. But still, I would say to anyone who's interested in competing, first thing I would say is find a local show, go there and watch the whole thing, just so you get a sense of how the things are run, what the standards are, what you're supposed to look like. Because if you've never been to a contest and you just decide I'm going to compete and you show up there, you could be in for a really terrible experience because you might be vastly unprepared. As far as a coach, you don't need a coach. When I was starting out competing, I did my first contest in 1989. There were no coaches. There was no internet. So it was a lot of just trial and error and hoping for the best. There were people that would mentor you if you were lucky enough to have one. I didn't really have any. But these days, there's so many online coaches. But the very first step I'd say is go to a contest, say, do I look anything like that? How far away from that look am I right now? You might need another year, 2 years of solid training and eating right before you're ready to get up on stage. Then I would say a coach can fast track you, can help prevent you from making a lot of mistakes, a lot of trial and error. I mean, if I had had a coach, I'm sure I would have advanced a little bit further, if not a lot further than I did, simply because I wasted years and years making mistakes. And I tried to learn from them. Sometimes I did, sometimes I didn't.
Yep.
But it was a long process. And I know if I'd had a really good coach from day one, or at least in the early stages, it would have saved me a lot of trouble, a lot of mistakes that I made.
Yeah, and I guess that's one of the great reasons we're talking today. Obviously, your failures you've learned from, you've gotten better, and are able to coach those people today. I think what a lot of people miss, though, especially and I've been to a couple of different shows before. I've never competed. I enjoy lifting weights. It's the nutrition piece is really, really difficult.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
a lot of people think, the more time they spend at the gym, they're going to get that physique. But as you've mentioned, a lot of it has to do with nutrition, right? So even if people are taking drugs, I mean, your nutrition still has to be on point, especially leading up to a show. Can you just kind of broadly talk about how important nutrition is, within that bodybuilding and fitness world, especially for competitive bodybuilders?
Yeah, I would say the biggest thing that's lacking in most people is a solid nutritional program. They're not really eating enough food. They're not eating often enough. A true bodybuilder is going to be eating 5 or 6 meals a day, pretty much at the same time. It's like Groundhog Day. Every day, I eat the same exact things every day at the same times. You can almost set your watch to it. 7 o'clock, 11 o'clock, 1 o'clock, 3:30, 6:30, 9:30, and it's the same exact foods every day. And I think it takes a lot of preparation. It takes a lot of planning. Make sure you have the proper things stocked in your refrigerator. You have to do food prep and cook these meals, portion them out. And that's where people fall short. They think if I train hard every day, and especially if I throw in some drugs, that's going to
Yeah.
make up for a lack of attention to my nutrition. It really doesn't. Everything has to work. There's I always say 3 sides to a pyramid: training, nutrition, and rest. And if any 3 sides of those pyramid are lacking, the whole thing collapses. When you're getting close to a competition, The diet is everything. You know, people want to look to drugs to get lean. Which drug's going to get me leaner? Which steroid? Which DNP, thyroid hormone, clenbuterol? I said those are all going to work to an extent, but if you're not eating a proper diet that's super clean, lower in carbs, uh, portioned out properly, timed right, you're not going to get the results. You're not going to get in shape. And that's if you compete. If anyone decides to compete, the one thing that you have to be is in condition. You have to be very, very lean. That's always critical. It doesn't matter how great your physique is. If you show up with more body fat than you're supposed to, you're not going to get looked at. You're going to be on the sidelines.
So is that what would take somebody, let's say, from being an amateur to moving up to some of the larger bodybuilding shows? Is it leanness? Is it muscle mass? Is it both? Like, kind of talk about. Okay, so I guess the best example is if you see a Division I college player that's really, really good, right, playing baseball, and then you compare them to somebody that's playing in the big leagues. It's a big jump, and you can easily notice that. Talk about that sort of analogy in the world of competitive bodybuilding. How does somebody like go from an amateur, obviously, to a pro?
Well, I mean, the unfortunate reality is, the inconvenient truth is, most people can't be pros. You have to be born with a very special set of genetic characteristics. Bone structure is the first thing. You have to have wide clavicles and narrow hips. Your arms and legs can't be too long or too short, so you have to have the right proportions in your bones. Obviously, your bones can't be changed. That's just a basic framework. Then you have muscle insertions. You need long muscle bellies, meaning if you're seeing somebody with very small calves, usually the calves, you'll notice they insert very high up near the kneecap. If you
Hmm.
ever see somebody with huge calves, the muscle goes all the way down to the ankle almost. That's nothing that those people didn't do anything special in their training to bring that down. That's from birth.
Hmm.
The bicep, if you flex your bicep and there's a massive gap and your bicep stops here and the rest is tendon, you're probably never going to have massive biceps. Where other people, it's fuller, it goes all the way down to the elbow joint. They're going to have potential because they have much more muscle cells. So you need that. You need the right shape. You can't have what I call blocky looking muscles. You want round, full muscles. Condition is like the last piece of the pie. Condition and presentation. You have to get all the body fat off. And I'd say out of all the people that compete, maybe 10% or less have the potential to be pro bodybuilders. It's probably closer to 5%. And even then, once you get to the national level, that's where you have more genetically gifted people because they've advanced that far and beat all the people at the lower levels at the local shows and regional shows. That's when things like your training, your coaching, nutrition, the PEDs, that's what starts to factor in more when people are on more of a genetically even playing field. And
Okay.
that's a whole other level. Because like
So,
you said, it's a massive difference between you know, kids playing college ball at Division III school versus somebody who's getting paid $50 million a year to play for the Yankees or something.
okay. Yeah. See, and that makes sense. So again, it comes to genetics, hard work. You've mentioned over and over consistency. So it's because a lot of young people, especially when we talk to them, and again, it's a lot of bad information out there online that hey, if I get on gear, steroids, right, and we'll jump into drugs here next. But if I get on these things, that's what's going to set me apart. But if I've really tried to pay attention to this whole bodybuilding and fitness world, and I've watched documentaries on it. I've listened to your content, but really, I mean, even if you're on gear, I mean, you're still having to train hard. I mean, again, it allows you to train longer and harder, as I want to talk with you about, recover faster, all that stuff. But the drugs alone aren't going to get you from point A to point B to be a pro. Just the same thing as in any professional sport. Just because you're taking drugs doesn't necessarily mean you're gonna get to that pro level or stay at that pro level. You've got to have the basics down, right? You've got to have the genetics and obviously God-given talent to do it. So let's kind of shift over to the discussion of appearance and performance enhancing substances, also known as performance enhancing drugs, testosterone, and anabolic steroids. Can we talk first about your experience with these drugs and then kind of work them into the discussion of how they fit into bodybuilding?
Sure. I'm going to tell a story I've never told before. When I was 17, I was going to a kickboxing place, and there were two older guys there that were like training together, sparring partners. And one was a police officer, but he was clearly on steroids. He was massive, and like a 20-inch neck, just to look like a bulldog. So I must have assumed he was on steroids. And I asked him, "Hey, buddy, can you get me some steroids?" He's like, "Oh yeah, sure." He sold me a bottle for $120. It was supposed to be Dianabol. I took it as I was supposed to. Nothing happened. So I'm pretty sure they were like Sudafed or something. Weren't steroids. So after that, I got disgusted. I didn't really vow to stay natural. I just didn't think about drugs for years and years. I competed naturally from 1989 till 95, a couple different natural organizations. And I'd say the turning point for me was in 95, I looked my best ever. I was 24, on the verge of turning 25. I got beat by a guy who had been a former drug user. And to me, in my mind, I said, well, the reason he beat me is because he used to be on drugs. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take drugs just long enough to get enough muscle so that I can beat all these other natural guys. I'll go back to being natural, and I'll be fine, which never is the case. I tell people, all of you out there who think you're going to do one cycle of steroids, no, that's like I'm going to use cocaine once.
Hmm.
It's usually not the case. Usually you're going to keep using it and using it. So I did wait. So that was July of 95. November of 96, I did my very first cycle. Sustanon from Mexico. There were these pre-made syringes with 250 milligrams. I had some veterinary Deca. Came in this huge bottle with pictures of cows and pigs and goats on it.
Jeez.
Yeah, that was my first cycle, and I blew up. It was a lot of fat and water for sure, but I put on like 25 pounds in 6 weeks. I got crazy strong. I was always a good squatter. I went from squatting like 365 to 500 for
Oh,
reps
wow.
within 6 or 8 weeks. I was hooked, and I did plan on stopping to use them, and I did take a break at one point for a year and another point for a year and a half. But other than that, I was consistently on cycles after that for well over 20, almost 25 years.
So during the time using those drugs, and it's interesting that, and thank you for sharing that. Number one, because I think it's important for people to understand, how these drugs work. Obviously, Ron, I'll never forget it. I don't know if I shared this when we did our last podcast together, but we were, doesn't matter what state we were in, but we were visiting with some school administrators, very large athletic conferences and that sort of thing. And I remember one of the adults, one of the administrators in the room was like, why don't, when you're going into high school, sharing your brother's story and your information, just tell the high school kids that they don't work and they won't use them?
Mm.
And I looked at the person, I said, you can't possibly be serious. Like, okay, that was a joke. Obviously, it wasn't funny. But at the same point, like, we can't question their intelligence. These drugs do work. That's why obviously these drugs were designed, whether it was for veterinary purposes or for, low testosterone, whatever the purposes might be of these drugs. So they do work. And I remember my brother telling me he had put on about 25, 30 pounds of muscle within the first 6 weeks, obviously started noticing all of these gains. But if you think from a high school standpoint, if we're doing this, and I've been into high school weight rooms and I've talked to strength coaches and school resource officers, like, we almost award this behavior of this massive muscle growth, or whether it's a massive increase in squats. So from somebody that has used these drugs, is it possible? So you went from 300 to 500 on squats. Is it possible in that short of time frame for you to be able to have those sorts of gains and weight gains and muscle gain without the use of drugs?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
Absolutely not. I mean, another myth that I bought into for years, because again, I was natural for years. I used to write and promote the natural lifestyle, and I was a holier than thou natural guy. I
Yep.
really looked down my nose at anybody that was using drugs, even though I worked alongside them. Um, I used to believe this myth. First of all, the American Medical Association used to put out that thing that steroids didn't work. That was their official statement for about 30 years. But I always thought I can get as big as these pro bodybuilders and as strong. I can be 250 pounds ripped. I can bench press 500. It's just going to take me longer, but it's just not true. The steroids take you, they enhance the ability that you have. So they will speed up the process, but they're also going to take you far past where you naturally would have got. And even people who have decided, I can't change their mind, they're going to use steroids. I said, at the very least, try to exhaust, fulfill, or in other words, your natural potential. Get as big and strong as you can naturally first. Then you've learned everything about training, nutrition, you're doing everything right. Then add the drugs in, you'll get much better results. And if you ever go off the drugs, you're not going to lose everything like a lot of guys do. Not sure where I was going with that, Don.
No, but I think when we're talking about these drugs, there's, obviously the drugs work, right? They work. But like with any other drug that's abused, again, and we would consider abuse obviously not being used for prescription. Like you were talking about some of the drugs you were using that was designed for animals, right? It wasn't designed for a human being. So let's talk about some of the side effects that you've experienced as a result of these drugs, because obviously when we do any sort of drug, whether it's alcohol or cocaine or marijuana, whatever the case might be, opioids, fentanyl, all those sorts of things come with side effects, right? There is a risk that is associated with going down this path. Let's talk about that for a couple minutes.
Sure. So the long-term side effects you're not going to see, the long-term health impacts you're not going to see for years. The damage they're going to do to your heart, your liver, your kidneys, that's going to take years to really build up. And that's why young people they don't really worry about it, because, if I say by the time you're 40, they say 40, oh my God. But in the short term, you're going to see things like a lot of water bloat, mood swings. I can distinctly remember just flying off the handle at my wife or my kids over the stupidest things.
Mm-hmm.
Certain steroids in particular, Tren, which has become, once I got it, when I first started Tren, it made me almost psychotic. A lot of these things are going to exacerbate, if you have a short fuse, normally, if you're somebody who has trouble with things like road rage or issues with your spouse or your kids, it's going to amplify those. It's like somebody who's prone to fighting, and you get them drunk and they're going to start
Yeah.
fights.
Yeah.
The very first thing I remember is the acne that broke out all over my back and my shoulders. That was from my very first cycle I ever did. I remember I got these big boil-like things that you could pop, and a substantial amount of pus would come out. It was pretty disgusting. But the temper flares, sleeplessness. Tren is probably the worst in terms of overall side effects out of everything. High blood pressure, but the long-term effects, obviously, Dr. O'Connor has extensively talked about those in his videos. Nobody's thinking about that. When you're 25, 30 years old even, I wasn't thinking about, well, what's going to happen when I'm 45 or 50 or 55?
Right.
And then you go to the cardiologist and they say your left ventricle is this thick. It's supposed to be this thick. Your ejection fraction's down. Your kidneys are damaged from high blood pressure that wasn't treated. I was very, very fortunate, Don, super fortunate, knock on wood. I attribute that to just, there's different types of genetics. Some people can tolerate, whether it's recreational drugs, performance-enhancing drugs, with less damage than other people. Other people that I knew who did exactly as much as I did with PEDs or even less, some of them are dead. Some of them have major heart problems. They've had bypass surgeries. Some of them have needed kidney dialysis. I mean, I got very lucky, but there's a lot of my peers who are no longer around, and a lot of them who they had to give up bodybuilding, and they gave up everything. Like they lost their health basically. So short term, those are things that are pretty reversible. Obviously, once you have that long term damage, clearly I guess you can get a new heart or new kidneys if you really want to, but it ain't easy.
Yeah, and one of the things you had mentioned is just sort of perspective, right? When you're in your 20s or even teens, and you get teens that get on these drugs, that's a long discussion. Like young people need to stay far, far away from these drugs. But you think about being that age, right? We're all that age one time. It's like you're invisible.
Yeah.
So it's almost the fact that, okay, I'm not thinking about it when I'm having a family, or is this going to affect fertility down the road if I choose to have a family. And I've talked to both men and women that have been on gear that have struggled down the road to have kids, and obviously there's doctors and things that can help with those. But you go back to thinking, okay, well, now I'm 40. Now I have all these health issues, or I could potentially have these health issues, or condolences for those of your friends and people within the industry that have died as a result of this. And we just need to be more open to discuss this. And I just would hope that anybody that's listening, especially our young people that are out there, you really got to think about this path before you go down it, because these are some of the things that can happen, whether it's short term or even long term.
Yeah, I forgot to say, it just occurred to me that a lot of the people using steroids, eventually your own production is going to shut down forever. And it's dose dependent. The more steroids you use and the longer you use them, the greater impact it's going to have on that. Dr. O'Connor calls it anabolic steroid induced hypogonadism. I don't know if he came up with that term, ASIH, but there are people he's treated as young as 20, 22 years old that have to be on TRT. They have to take shots of testosterone every week because their body's never going to produce it again. if you flood your body with enough exogenous synthetic testosterone, it's effectively telling it, well, we don't need to make tests anymore. And eventually the system that produces testosterone is completely destroyed, never going to work again. Now we have TRT. They'll just say, well, I'll just be on TRT. Yeah, I mean, it's one thing to start TRT at 40, 45 years old, like a lot of guys do, but to start it at 22 years old, and let's say you live to be 75, that's 55 years, 50 years of pinning yourself, sticking needles in yourself every week.
So, from a personal aspect, I mean, obviously you use these drugs, you use them for a long period of time. Is it something today where you have to continue to give yourself testosterone replacement therapy, to sustain some of those testosterone levels?
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm about to turn 55. I've been on TRT since I was just before I turned 40, so it's been almost
Wow.
15 years. Yeah, I destroyed my body's ability to make testosterone long, long ago.
And that's not, Ron, that's not something people talk about. And again, it's especially when we're in high schools and colleges, and, middle school students are a lot harder to talk about when it comes to this. You got to take it, more on the dietary supplement side and kind of basic understanding. But it's just really, really hard. And I remember being that age to sort of think out like, oh, what's it going to be like when I'm in my 30s or 40s, right? Because you're just living in the moment. But I really wish, people will take this information in from somebody like you that is being open and honest and sharing this, just some of the things that it's done to you. And even today, you're still having to use these drugs today as a result of a decision you made 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah, 100%. Hey, I'm not fear mongering, and I'm
Nope.
pro truth. I'm
Yep.
not anti steroid for people that are responsible adults. They want to use in moderate doses. They know the risks, and they're fully prepared to work with doctors and monitor, do the labs, do their art. I mean, I have a cardiologist now. Couple every year I go and see him right after my birthday, so it's coming up a couple weeks. Echocardiogram, ultrasound, stress test. Every other year I do a calcium score with the CAT scan machine or something. Um, but like you said, when you're 15, 16, 18 years old, you can't even imagine being 30. That's just
Hmm.
so far away. I mean, I was going to bring this up at some point. We've been losing bodybuilders like consistently one
Yeah.
a week lately. Just yesterday, we found out this 36-year-old guy from Czech Republic. They had been living in Florida. They called him, or his name was Ilya Golem, 36 years old. He's dead.
Jeez.
And he had been 350 pounds, and that was his gimmick, that he was this big, freaky guy. And I didn't realize that he dropped off the face of the earth a couple of years ago because he'd started getting very sick. He'd lost about 100 pounds. And 36 years old, to die at 36. Boston Lloyd was another Boston Lloyd was another kid who pushed the limits with the drug use. He died at 29 years old. I mean, it's hard to talk to an 18-year-old kid and say, you want to die at 29 or 30 or 35? And they're probably thinking, oh,
Yeah.
that's a long, healthy life, right? I mean, they have no
Yeah.
perspective. This is
Yeah.
why armies from the beginning of time have relied on very young men, because they have no fear and they have no concept of mortality.
Yeah.
You throw them on a beach with machine guns shooting at them, they're cool with that.
Yeah. And that's, I think, Ron, the biggest thing that we're lacking is education. I mean, this isn't a topic that's covered in schools. I mean, you might talk about it in health class and they'll talk about testicular atrophy and acne and all the things like, okay, well, that's not that bad, but we're not talking about any of the long-term stuff with the cardiovascular system or, those sorts of things. So education's important. But I think too, we live in a different world today than you and I grew up in, where again, the access to information is vast. You get on TikTok, Instagram, any of the meta, platforms, YouTube, and everybody's got their own opinion on this. Okay, but the big question we were getting, in fact, that sort of led to the discussion you, Dr. O'Connor, and I had about teens on trend. Is you have some of these social media influencers that are lightly talking about it, like, oh, you got to get on trend if you want to get big, and it's always that discussion. It's a meme, it's a different video where young people are talking about trend in this positive sort of light that it's not remotely dangerous, right? So last year, I remember this vividly. It was a middle school we were at, and this kid came up after the program. He's like, Don, do you think trend's safe? I'm just sitting here like, when you say trend, do you mean trend bone? Yeah, everybody's talking about it on social media. And then we started getting these questions from high school students. And I'll never forget this high school. It was a lower income high school just outside of Dallas. And this group of kids came up after, like, hey, is trend safe? And I was like, I'm getting this question a lot. what makes you think it's safe? And they were showing me some of these influencers that are openly talking about it. So I want to touch on Trenbolone as we start to wrap up here, because obviously you've mentioned it, you've got experience with it. Let's talk Trenbolone just for a minute, and I want you to respond to a high school kid asking you, Ron, is Tren safe?
It's absolutely not safe. It's one of the most toxic, dangerous steroids out there. Raises your blood pressure. Uh, the side effects of Tren are probably the most horrendous out of any steroid you can use. It's crazy to me that these kids, that's the one steroid they all know about now.
Yeah.
It's become almost the term for steroids. They don't say I'm on steroids. They say I'm on Tren. I don't even know if they're all on Tren,
No.
but geez, it keeps you up at night. You'll be sweating through the night. It plays with your brain. When I say psychotic, anger issues, anxiety, paranoia, you just don't feel good. You always feel like something's wrong. You feel like unsettled all the time. Like you can never really feel comfortable no matter what situation you're in. That's why most bodybuilders who are experienced, if they use it, they'll reserve it for the last few weeks before competition. They don't use it all year round. Um, it's it's crazy to me that that's sort of the gateway steroid now. That's like, they said in the recreational drug world, they always say like, well, marijuana is a great gateway drug, and eventually you'll get into the hard stuff like heroin or crystal meth or cocaine. This is like people going straight to that,
Yeah.
straight to the hardest.
Good analogy.
The other thing I say is I try to come up with analogies all the time. If you're just learning to drive, does it make sense to put you behind the wheel of a 12-cylinder Lamborghini that you touch the pedal and it can go 250 miles an hour? Wouldn't you be better off in, an economy car that can't
Yeah.
go that fast? And it's so disturbing to me that this is the one steroid. I think it's because of the catchy name, Tren. It just sounds cool. And these influencers, they're mostly very young guys.
Hmm.
And as Dr. O'Connor says, young bodies are very resilient.
Hmm.
I mean, the things I did to my body partying in my younger years, drinking, smoking, staying out all night, and you can recover. You feel fine the next day. Young people can get away with using things like Tren that are very toxic and very damaging just because they're young. But eventually, things start to add up. The side effects, and it's a cumulative thing. It bothers me that this is the one steroid that's taken on this mythic status. It is a very powerful steroid. It's very effective, but again, there is no justification for somebody 15, 16, even 18 years old. I don't think any teenagers should be using steroids at all because they're still in that process of life where your body's growing and maturing and producing all its own natural hormones. It's never going to happen again. Why would you take that one opportunity in your life, that one window, and throw it away? I would say at least wait till you're past that, till your body doesn't make all that stuff naturally anymore, because you're never going to be at that point again in your life.
Yeah,
Um,
and but again, it goes back to education. And one of the things we did, Ron, was we did an interview with Matthew Fedoruk, Dr. Fedoruk from the United States Anti-Doping Agency, who provided the science side of it. And then it was important, for us, from an education standpoint, because again, there's lots of misinformation out there, especially as it relates to the Tren. To have somebody like you that has actually consumed the drug, right, and to talk about the experience that you have with it, and to get an understanding of how these drugs work. So again, I appreciate your openness on that and just being a wealth of information on this topic, and obviously an author. So I do want to talk about sort of some of the resources and things that you've put out there, because you've shared your knowledge over the years on various platforms, right? You've written books, on Amazon titled "Real Bodybuilding: Muscle Truth from 25 Years in the Trenches." Let's talk about what inspired you to write the book. Okay, perfect. You've got it right there. And I'll also put a link in the show notes too. But what would a reader get out of this book?
so in that book, I tried to be very comprehensive and give like a basic education in bodybuilding, everything you really need to know. Um, are you ready to compete? Yeah. I mean, I started with the basics of training, nutrition, rest, basic supplementation. I just wanted to be like a primer, like if there was a bodybuilding college course, maybe this would be like one of the books that would be on the required reading list. I wanted people to be armed with information and knowledge because knowledge is power. One thing, one of the downsides of this access to information that we have with social media now is there's a lot of bad information out there. There's no in the days of magazines gone past, they were the gatekeepers. They were editors that had to read. And if they didn't think you were up to snuff, they didn't publish your work. That was it. Anybody gets published now. Anyone can declare themselves an expert. And especially if they look good, people are going to listen to them, not realizing that some of these people are genetically gifted. They could do pretty much anything. It's unfortunate, but true. Any kind of weight training, as long as they eat a little bit of food, maybe throw in some
Mhm.
PDs, they're going to look way better than just about most people will. But that doesn't mean that they have any actual knowledge or experience. It just means this is how they look. So, yeah, I mean, that to me, that's the worst thing about social media is that you have people out there who are authority figures without really having the credentials or any real experience. Some have only been training a couple of years. They're very new to the game. But again, we judge by appearance. And if these people look good, young people especially, they're so impressionable. I mean, I don't blame these kids today. If I was 16, 17 years old now, and I was looking at social media and seeing, okay, this guy looks, that's how I want to look like this guy. Whatever he's selling, I'm buying.
Yeah. And that is the world sadly we live in. We live in this, hyperactive world where it's, I want this six pack, I want this, and nobody realized the hard work that it takes. And one of the things my dad always told me growing up, and it's really hard to grasp this, but it's like your perspective over time changes. And even once you have kids, right, that perspective on life changes once again. And that's why I felt it was important to have somebody like you on, where it's okay, like you said, you can go somebody maybe that's trained for a couple of years, they got great genetics. I got two or three friends that they don't even have to work out and they have a six pack. It's one of those guys, right? So, but somebody that's doing looks that way, right, that maybe they're not training all that much, or they're trying to sell the latest and greatest dietary supplement, or they've come up with their own supplement brand,
Sure.
right? So people are wanting to buy into that. They think that, by taking these three supplements this person's going to take and maybe working out for an hour a day, that is going to help get me that six pack or that physique I want. Where we take somebody like you who still has a great physique, you work out, but you've done it. You've been doing this and at it for 30 years. So it's really wanting to take perspective of somebody like you that has experience in this world, from being natty to being on gear to all the things, to where you are today. And you would hope that the young person would kind of look at you like almost like you would look at your dad and take this information and use it, obviously to your advantage, and have that knowledge before you make an uneducated decision, to use drugs or, get into some of these other things that people are in the fitness and bodybuilding world.
Yeah, I wish there were people kind of like me that were younger, because the reality is a lot of these young kids, they can't relate to me. I'm just too old. I'm older than most of their dads. So they look at me as someone who's like a dinosaur, who's obsolete. This guy doesn't know anything. I'm going to listen to this kid with the cool hair who's 21 years old and he's got 4 million followers. And here he is with his Ferrari and he's got hot girls and this and that. And I get that. I totally get that. I just wish there were more voices of reason that were younger, that the younger people relate to, because the reality is most of these young people, they're not going to listen to somebody who's old enough to be their dad or older, because they just think we're on like a different planet than they are. We're from another time, another era, which we are. I get it.
Yep. Yep.
But it's hard to talk sense to them. I do occasionally get inquiries from these kids looking for advice, and sometimes they listen with an open mind, and sometimes I can tell they're already guarded.
Yeah, it's funny because in one of our first discussions, you were talking about like this was pre-internet, right? And it's hard to remember those days. I remember first getting on Yahoo. You're like, well, what is this, right? It opens access to a whole different world. But today we have things like Instagram and YouTube, and I want to talk about some of the other places that you are. Where if somebody's interested in this world and wants to hear more from you, how do they find you on Instagram and YouTube? And I'll also, Ron, be able to put all these links and your email and whatever other information you have within the show notes, so that if somebody wants to click and contact you, they can.
Appreciate it. Yeah, Don. So it's Ron Harris Muscle. I try to keep that across all platforms. So my Instagram is at Ron Harris Muscle, no spaces or anything. My YouTube channel is just called Ron Harris Muscle. I do a lot of content based on covering bodybuilding shows, pro shows, interviewing athletes. There are some Q&As. I do some live shows, Ask Ron, where we go over anything that the viewers want to talk about: training, nutrition, drugs, rest. It comes into all things. So if they subscribe to the channel, they'll get notifications. And yeah, I mean, I'm also working with Dr. O'Connor on this testosteronology app. I'm the influencer manager. So if there are any influencers out there who are interested in working with the company, possibly becoming partnered up with us, please DM me on Instagram at Ron Harris Muscle. Be more than willing to talk to you about that. And that's about it, man. There's other things in the works, but I
Yep.
don't talk about those until they're a reality.
Yeah, so I guess really the last question I want to leave you is with all this knowledge and your dad, right? So again, perspective changes, and so you've got a son. I know that's into bodybuilding. Is this an open discussion you have with him as well? Obviously, he's on the internet and can hear all of your stories, but do you guys have the open discussion of going down the route of performance enhancing drugs and the hard work and nutrition? Can you kind of talk about that from a father's perspective? That you have a son, likely of an age listener that's listening, and obviously he went through the middle school and high school ages too. With your knowledge and the expertise that you have in this industry, what were some of those conversations when he was growing up?
So yeah, my son Christian, he'll turn 25 in a couple weeks. This is recorded in September of 2024. But he didn't ever really want to train or be a bodybuilder. I used to drag him to the gym for years. From age 12 on, I started taking the gym. I said, "You're going to exercise. I don't care if you become a bodybuilder, but you're going to have a strong, healthy body.
Yeah.
I'm gonna train you. You're going to do full body circuits and this and that." And eventually, toward the end of high school, I would say, is when he started noticing results, started seeing a change in the way he looked, and he liked it, and he got more into bodybuilding. He's kind of late in the game because I was already competing by 19, but he's going to start competing next year. We have had the discussion many times about performance enhancers. One thing that's keeping him natural, we did a whole video about it, why I'm keeping my son natural. He actually, it was both of us actually sitting here talking and taking questions from viewers and stuff. But he's got ulcerative colitis, which sort of limits his absorption of food and things like that. So I wouldn't want him to do anything that could possibly jeopardize his health anymore, because that's a pretty serious health
Oh yeah.
issue. There's no cure. He's going to have that for the rest of his life. He's managed it with medication and diet and things like that. But, he was tempted. Of course he's tempted. He sees all these guys on Instagram and TikTok, YouTube that are his age or even younger that they're jacked. He would love to look like these guys, but he knows he's seen me. The one thing about seeing the bad side of what steroids do to a person is he was a first-hand witness. He had a front row seat.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes when he was very young, I would lose my temper with him over the dumbest things, most insignificant things. And, I believe me, I have a lot of regrets about that. Uh, you know, one thing, the younger guys can't comprehend this, but you're not going to be the best parent or father on steroids. You're just not. Some people are going to be a lot worse than others. But yeah, he's dead set on staying natural. He's going to compete in a natural show next year. He knows what steroids can do. He knows the good and the bad sides of them. He's been very well educated, so he knows a lot more about the pluses and the minuses, the positives and the negatives than most kids at his age would.
Well, no, and thank you for being open about that. I think that's super important, especially for our young people. That it goes back to education, right? Like in school for years and years and years, you hear about smoking cigarettes, drinking alcohol, marijuana, cocaine, heroin. We hear about all those day in and day out and day in and day out. But when you're on YouTube, you're not following somebody that's getting high all the time, or that's drinking all the time. You're not following those people, right? And today we live in that world of lots of information. People are into the fitness industry; they're getting a lot about it, but nobody's talking openly about the things that these drugs can do to us, whether it's mental or physical. So for those of you, and Ron, I want to wrap up just with what we call our curveball round. And anybody that tunes into the All Me podcast knows that these have nothing to do with our discussion today. They're three fun questions. And
Oh,
what
great.
we ask our guests to do is I'm going to ask you a question. It's going to be completely random. First thing that comes to mind, you'll just respond to it. You let me know when you're ready, and we'll start with question one.
Go for it, Don.
All right, question one. This one's kind of interesting. If animals could talk, which one do you think would be the rudest?
I would say a warthog.
Okay, good answer. Now, question two. What is the weirdest food combination that you secretly enjoy?
Oh, oh, jeez.
I will. Yeah, I will have a lot of different food combinations. I want to make a whole book of sandwiches of just different sandwiches I've put together.
I, I guess I would say fried plantains and eggs. Yeah.
Okay, that's pretty interesting. I guess unless you're in Latin America, right?
Yeah. Well, my
So,
wife's vegan. So.
yep. Okay, there you go. So that definitely helps on clarify that. Now, last question: what is something you've always wanted to try but haven't had a chance yet?
Skydiving.
I was hoping you would say that. I would like to try that too. My wife says, "No way, I can't leave her with the two kids."
Yeah. And I don't think either of us say we haven't had a chance. We could do it if we really wanted to. But yeah, I mean, I have that fear in the back of my head. Like, what if I'm that one in 10,000 people and the parachute doesn't open? Uh, my grandfather, who I never met, he died 2 years before I was born. On his 70th birthday, this is like a family legend. He was skydiving and he landed bad and broke his leg. So
Uh,
yeah,
but he did it.
no, he lived. He lived another, 10 or 12 years after that. No, I think he lived about 5 years. But yeah,
Yeah.
he did. I never did.
Well, maybe that's something you could put on your YouTube channel once you have an opportunity to jump out of a plane.
Oh boy, I mean, I'm sure it's thrilling. I've talked to a lot of people who've done it. You probably have too, and they say
Oh,
it's an amazing, thrilling, death-defying experience. The adrenaline rush must be just so intense. I can only imagine.
I've bungee jumped once.
Oh wow.
But
Ooh.
that was about it. I'm not a big fan of heights. I don't like being in high. I have no problems flying on an airplane. I mean, obviously, I fly over 100,000 miles a year, right? But it's like having to open that door of the airplane and look down. I think that's the point. Like you're going to have to push me out because I'm not going willingly.
All those things they show on YouTube where this is like there's some ledge that you walk on to bed. It's like a ten
No,
thousand foot
no,
drop, and all these people are like, oh hell no,
no.
hell no, I wouldn't never do.
I'm out. I'm out. Well, Ron, man, this has been awesome, man. I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to share your very, very personal stories with us. I know that's never easy, but I think, especially for listeners and as humans, as we grow, we need to hear other people's experiences to help make better decisions for ourselves and be educated. So we really appreciate you joining us.
I very much appreciate you having me on, Don. Thank you.